Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through the dusty corners of history, where the mundane becomes mesmerizing and the ordinary reveals its extraordinary secrets. Tonight we're diving into something so fundamental, so daily, so utterly taken for granted, that most people never stop to think about it. Breakfast. But not just any breakfast, we're talking about what Romans ate when they stumbled out of bed 2,000 years ago. Probably hungover from too much wine, and wondering why their slaves were already up grinding grain. Before we begin this culinary voyage through time, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy these deep dives into historical minutiae, and subscribe only if you genuinely find comfort in learning about ancient eating habits while you drift off to sleep. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what you had for breakfast today. I'm genuinely curious how your morning meal compares to what we're about to explore. Now settle in, maybe grab a warm drink, dim those lights, and let's ease into the slow, methodical world of Roman morning rituals. Turn on that fan for some gentle white noise, pull up your blankets, and prepare to discover how the most powerful empire in the ancient world started their days. Spoiler alert. It wasn't with artisanal avocado toast or pumpkin spice anything. The Roman Empire at its height stretched from Britain to the Middle East, encompassing millions of people who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and had wildly different customs. But they all shared one thing in common. They had to eat something when they woke up. What that something was depended entirely on who you were, where you lived, and how much money your family had managed to scrape together. If you were expecting some grand tale of imperial banquets and exotic delicacies, well, you're in for a disappointment. Roman breakfast was about as exciting as watching paint dry on a rainy afternoon. It was utilitarian, practical, and designed to fuel the body for whatever back-breaking labor or bureaucratic tedium lay ahead. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of grabbing a granola bar on your way out the door. Except the granola bar was stale bread, and you were probably heading off to build an aqueduct. The Romans called their morning meal ientaculum, which sounds fancy until you realize it basically meant the thing you eat when you break your fast. They weren't particularly poetic about food in the morning. That creativity was saved for their elaborate dinner parties where they'd lounge around eating peacock tongues and debating philosophy. Morning was for survival, not sophistication. Most Romans, and by most, we mean the vast majority who weren't senators or wealthy merchants, woke up in cramped apartments called insulae. These were basically ancient tenements, often 5 or 6 stories high, with no running water, no central heating, and definitely no kitchens. The smell alone would have knocked you unconscious. Imagine thousands of people living in close quarters with minimal sanitation, cooking over small braziers, and trying to pretend they weren't one bad harvest away from starvation. The typical Roman breakfast happened in darkness, long before dawn broke over the 7 hills. There were no alarm clocks, just the natural rhythm of a city that went to bed when the sun set and rose when necessity demanded. Workers, slaves, shopkeepers, and craftsmen would stumble from their beds onto floors that were often just packed earth, covered with a thin layer of rushes or straw. Water was precious and not always clean, so most Romans started their day with a drink that was safer than the questionable liquid flowing through the city's fountains. Posca was the beverage of choice for the working classes, essentially watered-down wine mixed with vinegar. It sounds revolting, and it probably was, but it killed bacteria and provided a small amount of alcohol to take the edge off another day of imperial servitude. The wealthy, of course, had options. They might sip more some, a mixture of wine and honey that was infinitely more palatable than Posca, but still served the same basic function of providing liquid calories and mild intoxication. Some even had access to fresh milk, though refrigeration being a concept still about 15 centuries away. It had to be consumed quickly before it turned into an entirely different kind of breakfast experience. The preparation of mulsum was an art form in itself, one that wealthy households took seriously. The honey had to be the finest available often imported from specific regions known for their superior bees. Greek honey from Mount Hymettus was particularly prized, as was honey from Sicily or the hills of Latium. The wine used in Mulsum was carefully selected, usually a lighter variety that wouldn't overpower the delicate sweetness of the honey. Slaves in wealthy households would spend considerable time perfecting the ratios, heating the mixture just enough to blend the ingredients without destroying the honey's subtle flavors. Some families had recipes that had been passed down for generations, closely guarded secrets that distinguished their breakfast table from those of their social rivals. The temperature at which Mulsum was served was crucial. Too hot, and it became medicinal. Too cold, and the flavors wouldn't marry properly. The vessels used for serving Mulsum were often works of art themselves: silver cups engraved with family crests, glass bowls that showed off the golden color of the mixture, or ceramic vessels painted with scenes from mythology. The wealthy didn't just drink their breakfast, they displayed it, using every aspect of the morning meal to demonstrate their refinement and status. For the truly elite, breakfast might include imported delicacies that most Romans never saw: dates from Palestine, figs from Asia Minor, or exotic spices that had traveled thousands of miles along trade routes. These ingredients weren't just expensive, they were statements of political and economic power, proof that the family had connections that reached to the far corners of the empire. The logistics of maintaining such a breakfast table were staggering. Wealthy households employed specialized slaves, whose only job was managing food procurement and preparation. There were slaves who did nothing but shop in the markets each morning, selecting the finest ingredients available. Others were responsible for storage, ensuring that delicate items were kept at proper temperatures and humidity levels. Kitchen slaves in elite households underwent extensive training in food preparation techniques. They learned not just how to cook, but how to present food in ways that would impress guests and reinforce their master's status. A simple piece of bread might be arranged with artistic precision, garnished with herbs, or served on expensive imported plates that cost more than most Romans earned in a year. The timing of breakfast in wealthy households was carefully orchestrated. Unlike the poor, who ate whenever they could grab a moment, the rich could afford to make breakfast a leisurely affair. Slaves would wake hours before their masters to ensure that everything was perfectly prepared when the family finally chose to break their fast. But even among the wealthy, there were gradations of luxury that created subtle hierarchies of morning indulgence. A moderately successful merchant might enjoy decent wine and fresh bread, while a senator's family would expect delicacies that had been specially ordered days in advance. The emperor's breakfast table represented the pinnacle of Roman culinary achievement, featuring ingredients and preparations that were literally fit for a god. Imperial breakfast culture was so elaborate that it required its own bureaucracy. There were officials whose only responsibility was ensuring that the emperor's morning meal met the highest standards. Tasters checked every item for poison, while specialized cooks prepared dishes according to recipes that were state secrets. The emperor's breakfast wasn't just a meal, it was a political statement about the power and sophistication of the empire itself. The contrast between imperial and peasant breakfast was so stark that they might as well have been different civilizations entirely. While the emperor sipped rare wines from distant provinces, millions of his subjects were grateful for watered-down vinegar that didn't make them sick. This disparity wasn't seen as problematic by Roman society, it was simply the natural order of things, as inevitable as the sunrise. Regional specialties added another layer of complexity to wealthy breakfast tables. A family with estates in different provinces might enjoy olives from Spain, wine from Gaul, and grain from Egypt, all at the same meal. This geographic diversity was both a pleasure and a display of the family's far-reaching influence and economic resources. The social aspects of wealthy breakfast culture were as important as the food itself. Business deals were often concluded over morning meals. Political alliances were forged over shared cups of Mulsum, and social hierarchies were reinforced through carefully choreographed displays of hospitality. Who was invited to breakfast, where they sat, and what they were served all carried deep meaning in Roman society. Women in wealthy households played complex roles in breakfast culture. While they couldn't participate in political discussions that might take place during the meal, they were responsible for managing the household staff that made elaborate breakfasts possible. A competent mistress of the house could enhance her husband's reputation through the quality of hospitality she provided. The education of wealthy children included instruction in proper breakfast etiquette. Young Romans learned not just how to eat, but how to eat in ways that demonstrated their breeding and sophistication. Table manners, conversation skills, and knowledge of food and wine were all part of the curriculum that prepared them for adult roles in high society. Seasonal variations in wealthy breakfast menus were dramatic and eagerly anticipated. Spring brought the first fresh fruits and vegetables after winter's preserved foods. Summer offered an abundance of choices that allowed for elaborate displays of plenty. Autumn featured harvest specialties, while winter meals showcased the family's ability to maintain luxury even when fresh ingredients were scarce. The health beliefs of the time influenced breakfast choices among the wealthy. Roman medicine, such as it was, emphasized the importance of balancing bodily humors through proper food choices. Breakfasts might be adjusted based on the season, the diner's age and constitution, or even the phase of the moon. These beliefs were nonsensical by modern standards, but they added another layer of complexity to meal planning. Wealthy Romans also had to navigate the social and political implications of their food choices. Eating too lavishly might be seen as decadent or unpatriotic, while eating too simply might suggest financial problems or lack of proper appreciation for one's station. The breakfast table became a stage where social and political messages were carefully communicated through culinary choices. The preservation and storage of luxury breakfast ingredients required sophisticated techniques and equipment. Wealthy households had specialized storage rooms with different climate conditions for different types of food. Ice, when available, was brought down from mountains and stored in underground chambers to keep certain delicacies fresh. These preservation methods were expensive and labor-intensive, but they allowed the wealthy to enjoy foods that would have been impossible for ordinary Romans to obtain. Competition among wealthy families extended to their breakfast tables. Hosting a memorable morning meal could enhance a family's social standing, while serving an inadequate breakfast could damage their reputation. This competitive aspect of breakfast culture drove innovation in food preparation and presentation, as families sought new ways to impress their guests and rivals. The tableware used for wealthy breakfasts was often more valuable than entire households of ordinary Romans. Silver plates, crystal glasses, and ivory-handled utensils weren't just functional. They were investments that demonstrated the family's wealth and taste. Some pieces were family heirlooms passed down through generations, while others were specially commissioned from renowned craftsmen. The decline of wealthy breakfast culture began subtly, with small compromises that initially seemed temporary. Perhaps imported honey became too expensive, so families switched to local varieties. Maybe certain seasonal delicacies became unreliable, forcing menu adjustments. These minor changes accumulated over time, gradually eroding the elaborate breakfast traditions that had taken centuries to develop. As political instability increased and economic uncertainty grew, even wealthy families found themselves making choices that would have been unthinkable to their ancestors. The breakfast table, once a symbol of abundance and sophistication, became a daily reminder of a world that was slowly slipping away from the standards that had defined Roman civilization at its peak. Bread was the foundation of Roman breakfast, but not the fluffy, yeast-risen loaves we know today. Roman bread was dense, coarse, and often gritty from the stone mills used to grind the grain. The flour wasn't refined, so you were getting bits of husk, occasional pebbles from the grinding process, and whatever insects had made their home in the grain stores. It was nutritious in the way that survival food is nutritious. It kept you alive, but it wasn't winning any culinary awards. The quality of bread varied dramatically based on social class. The wealthy enjoyed panis candidus, a whiter bread made from more finely ground flour. The poor made do with panis sordidus, a dark, coarse bread that was often more sawdust than grain. Sometimes it was so hard that it had to be soaked in wine or water just to make it chewable. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of hardtack, except you had to eat it every single morning for your entire life. Fresh bread was a luxury that most Romans couldn't afford daily. More often, breakfast bread was day-old or older, purchased from the neighbourhood bakery or distributed as part of the grain dole that kept the urban masses from rioting. The phrase bread and circuses wasn't just political commentary, it was literally what kept Roman society functioning. Give people enough carbohydrates to survive and enough entertainment to distract them, and they won't overthrow the government. To make stale bread more palatable, Romans developed various techniques that would make modern food scientists weep. They'd soak it in wine, olive oil, or even honey if they could afford it. Sometimes they'd toast it over a small fire, creating what might generously be called the world's first French toast, though it bore little resemblance to the custardy delight we know today. The more prosperous Romans might add olives to their morning meal, not the plump, oil-cured varieties we enjoy, but small bitter olives that had been preserved in brine. These provided salt, fat, and a sharp tang that helped wake up the palate. Olives were also practical. They kept well without refrigeration and provided essential nutrients that the grain-heavy Roman diet often lacked. Cheese was another breakfast staple, though again, not the aged artisanal varieties that grace modern charcuterie boards. Roman cheese was fresh, simple, and made from whatever milk was available, usually goat or sheep, as cows were considered too valuable for labour to be used primarily for dairy. The cheese was often crumbly, salty, and had to be consumed quickly before it spoiled in the Mediterranean heat. Eggs were a luxury item for most Romans, reserved for special occasions or the tables of the wealthy. When they did appear at breakfast, they were usually boiled or fried in olive oil over a small brazier. The eggs came from chickens, though wealthy Romans might occasionally enjoy eggs from more exotic birds. There were no massive industrial chicken farms, so eggs were seasonal, expensive, and treated with the reverence we might reserve for caviar. Meat at breakfast was almost unheard of for the common people. The wealthy might enjoy some preserved sausage or leftover roasted meat from the previous day's dinner, but for most Romans, animal protein was a rare treat reserved for festivals or special occasions. The empire ran on grain, vegetables, and the occasional piece of fish, not on the protein-heavy diets that modern nutritionists recommend. Fruits were seasonal and location-dependent. In the summer, Romans might enjoy fresh figs, grapes, or apples with their morning meal. These were eaten fresh when available, or dried and stored for the winter months. Honey was the primary sweetener, and it was precious enough that most people used it sparingly. Sugar as we know it wouldn't reach Europe for centuries, so the Roman sweet tooth had to be satisfied with whatever nature provided. The preparation of breakfast was as much about social hierarchy as nutrition. Wealthy households had slaves whose entire job was food preparation. These kitchen slaves would rise hours before their masters to grind grain, mix dough, tend fires, and prepare the morning meal. They knew exactly how their owners preferred their bread toasted, their wine mixed, and their cheese sliced. For the poor, breakfast preparation was a family affair, usually handled by the women of the household. They would rise in the darkness, rekindle the cooking fire from carefully preserved embers, and prepare whatever food the family could afford. Children learned early to help with these morning rituals, understanding that their survival depended on everyone contributing to the household's functioning. The timing of breakfast varied considerably. Labourers might eat before dawn and then head off to construction sites, farms, or workshops, where they would toil until evening. Merchants and shopkeepers might eat slightly later, timing their meal to coincide with the opening of their businesses. The wealthy, being the wealthy, could eat whenever they pleased, though even they generally followed the practical rhythm of eating early to fuel the day's activities. The workplace breakfast culture of ancient Rome revealed fascinating distinctions between different trades and social classes. Construction workers building the empire's famous roads, aqueducts, and monuments typically ate their morning meal in complete darkness, often while still lying on their sleeping mats in crude dormitories. These men would consume whatever portable food they had managed to secure the previous evening, usually hard bread that could be eaten without preparation, and watered wine that provided both hydration and mild pain relief for bodies already aching from yesterday's labour. The construction sites themselves became temporary communities with their own breakfast rituals. Foremen might share slightly better food with their crews as a way of maintaining loyalty and work quality. Skilled stonemasons and engineers, being more valuable than common labourers, often received rations that included cheese or olives, along with the standard bread and posca. These small privileges created hierarchies within the working class that were carefully observed and jealously guarded. Agricultural workers faced different challenges entirely. Farmers and field hands needed to time their breakfast around seasonal demands and weather patterns. During harvest season, they might eat in the dark and work until well past sunset, grabbing whatever sustenance they could manage between the urgent demands of gathering crops before they spoiled. In winter, breakfast might be delayed until the sun had warmed the air enough to make outdoor work bearable. The breakfast culture of Roman farms varied dramatically based on the size and prosperity of the operation. Large estates with hundreds of slaves operated almost like small cities, with specialized cooks responsible for feeding the workforce. These estate kitchens would prepare enormous quantities of simple food porridge, made from whatever grains were available, bread baked in large outdoor ovens, and huge vats of posca that could supply dozens of workers. Small family farms, by contrast, operated on a subsistence model where breakfast was whatever the family could spare from their limited stores. These farmers lived constantly on the edge of hunger, knowing that a bad harvest could mean starvation. Their breakfast was often nothing more than bread and water, with occasional additions of vegetables from their kitchen gardens, or milk from a goat if they were fortunate enough to keep livestock. The urban working classes developed their own distinct breakfast traditions based on the constraints of city living. Craftsmen in workshops, blacksmiths, carpenters, potters, and leather workers often ate breakfast at their workplaces rather than in their cramped living quarters. Many workshops had small cooking areas where apprentices would prepare simple meals for the entire team. These workshop breakfasts became important social times. When master craftsmen would discuss the day's work, apprentices would receive instruction, and news from the city would be shared. The quality of breakfast often reflected the prosperity of the workshop. Successful businesses could afford better food for their workers, while struggling craftsmen might offer nothing more than bread and water. The guild system that organised many trades included provisions for ensuring that workers received adequate nutrition. Some guilds maintained communal kitchens or arranged for bulk purchasing of breakfast ingredients at reduced prices. These cooperative arrangements helped maintain social solidarity among workers and provided a safety net during difficult times. Shopkeepers and small merchants faced unique breakfast challenges because they needed to open their businesses early to catch customers heading to work or market. Many ate standing behind their counters, grabbing bites of bread or sips of wine between serving customers. The successful operation of a shop often depended on the owner's ability to multitask, preparing inventory, handling sales, and maintaining personal nutrition all at the same time. The breakfast culture of Roman markets was particularly vibrant and complex. Vendors who sold food items often ate their own products, providing a form of quality control that customers could observe. A baker who eagerly consumed his own bread was advertising its quality, while a wine merchant who avoided his own products sent a clear message about their dubious nature. Market vendors developed strategies for maintaining energy throughout long sales days, that often began before dawn and continued past sunset. They learned to eat small amounts frequently, rather than consuming large meals that might make them sluggish during busy periods. The rhythm of market breakfast became synchronized with the flow of customers, quick bites during slow periods, postponed meals during rush times. Military breakfast culture deserves special attention because soldiers were among the few Romans who could count on regular, standardized nutrition. The Roman army had developed sophisticated systems for feeding troops in the field, recognizing that hungry soldiers were ineffective soldiers. Military breakfast typically consisted of boccolatum, a type of hardtack, posca, and occasionally bacon or cheese when supplies permitted. The preparation of military breakfast was a highly organized affair that reflected the Roman genius for logistics. Each century, roughly 80 men, had designated cooks who were responsible for preparing meals according to strict schedules and portions. These military cooks were trained in food safety and preservation techniques that were far superior to civilian practices, partly because military effectiveness depended on preventing foodborne illness that could incapacitate entire units. On campaign, Roman soldiers often ate breakfast while marching, consuming portable foods that could be prepared the night before and eaten without stopping. This practice allowed armies to cover enormous distances while maintaining fighting effectiveness, a crucial advantage in military operations that could determine the fate of empires. The breakfast rations provided to soldiers were calculated based on detailed understanding of nutritional needs for men engaged in strenuous physical activity. While the food wasn't luxurious, it was generally adequate and reliable in ways that civilian food often wasn't. This created a situation where military service, despite its dangers, offered better nutrition than many Romans could obtain in civilian life. Naval personnel faced even greater challenges in breakfast preparation and consumption. Ships had limited cooking facilities and storage space, forcing sailors to rely heavily on preserved foods that could withstand long voyages without spoiling. Ship's biscuit, salted meat, and watered wine became the standard breakfast for men who might spend months at sea without touching land. The breakfast culture aboard Roman ships developed its own traditions and hierarchies. Officers enjoyed better food than common sailors, but even admirals were constrained by the limitations of shipboard cooking. The ability to provide decent meals for the crew became an important leadership skill for naval commanders, who understood that well-fed sailors were more likely to remain loyal and effective during long voyages. Slaves, who made up a significant portion of the Roman population, had breakfast experiences that varied dramatically based on their circumstances and the character of their owners. Household slaves in wealthy families often ate better than free citizens in poor families, while slaves working in mines or quarries received barely enough food to keep them alive. The breakfast provided to slaves was usually leftovers from their master's meals, supplemented with cheap ingredients like porridge or gruel. Some enlightened slave owners recognized that well-fed slaves were more productive and provided adequate nutrition as a practical investment. Others viewed slaves as expendable resources and fed them accordingly. Urban slaves often had opportunities to supplement their assigned rations by purchasing additional food with smaller amounts of money they earned through tips or side work. This created an underground economy where slaves traded services, information, and small luxuries in exchange for better breakfast ingredients. Rural slaves, particularly those working on large agricultural estates, sometimes had access to fresh vegetables, milk, and eggs that weren't available to urban populations. However, this advantage was offset by the physical demands of agricultural labor, which required more calories than the typical slave diet provided. The breakfast culture of Roman women was largely invisible in historical records, but archaeological evidence and occasional literary references suggest that women's morning meals were often hastily consumed while managing household responsibilities. Women of all social classes typically ate less than men, partly due to cultural expectations about feminine behavior, and partly because limited resources were usually allocated to male family members first. Upper-class women sometimes participated in elaborate breakfast social rituals that combined eating with business and political activities. These morning gatherings allowed elite women to network, exchange information, and influence their husbands' political and economic decisions. The food served at these events was often secondary to the social and political purposes they served. Working-class women faced the challenge of feeding their families, while often going without adequate nutrition themselves. Mothers would frequently sacrifice their own breakfast portions to ensure their children received enough food, a practice that contributed to widespread malnutrition among women and had serious implications for maternal and infant health. The breakfast habits of Roman children varied enormously based on their families' economic circumstances. Children from wealthy families enjoyed diverse, nutritious meals that supported their physical and intellectual development. Poor children often received minimal nutrition that stunted their growth and limited their potential for social advancement. Education and breakfast were closely connected for privileged children, who learned proper eating behaviors as part of their social training. These children were taught not just what to eat, but how to eat in ways that demonstrated their breeding and social status. Table manners, conversation skills, and knowledge of food and wine became important markers of cultural sophistication. Hygiene around food preparation was, by modern standards, horrifying. There was no understanding of bacteria or foodborne illness. Meat was often stored without proper preservation, milk spoiled quickly, and cooking surfaces were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Romans did their best with the knowledge they had, but food poisoning was a constant threat that they simply accepted as part of life. The kitchens of the poor were usually just a corner of their single room, equipped with a small brazier or portable oven. Smoke had no proper ventilation, so it would fill the living space, creating a perpetual haze that stung the eyes and lungs. Cooking was done in simple clay pots and pans, often shared between multiple families living in the same building. Water for cooking came from public fountains, carried in clay vessels by whoever was available to make the trip. This water was of questionable quality. The Romans built magnificent aqueducts, but they hadn't figured out filtration or water treatment. Disease was common, and no one really understood why some water sources made people sick while others seemed safe. Storage of food was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, everything had to be consumed quickly or preserved through salting, drying, or fermentation. Wealthy households had underground storage areas that stayed cool, but the poor had to make do with whatever containers they could afford and whatever cool spaces they could find. The social aspects of breakfast were minimal. This wasn't a meal for lingering conversation or family bonding. It was fuel for the body, consumed quickly and efficiently before the day's work began. Families might eat together if their schedules aligned, but more often, people ate when they could, grabbing whatever was available and heading off to their obligations. Even the wealthy didn't make breakfast a social occasion. Their elaborate meals happened in the evening, when there was time for multiple courses, entertainment, and philosophical discussion. Morning was for business, even for those who could afford to make it leisurely. The nutritional content of Roman breakfast was actually quite good by historical standards, though it would horrify modern dietitians. The combination of bread, olive oil, cheese, and wine provided carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and calories. It wasn't balanced by contemporary understanding, but it sustained millions of people through demanding physical labor. Seasonal variations were dramatic. Summer brought fresh fruits and vegetables, while winter meant relying on stored grains, preserved foods, and whatever could be foraged. A bad harvest could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation, and Romans lived with this uncertainty constantly. Regional differences were enormous across the empire. A breakfast in Britain would be entirely different from one in Egypt or Spain. Local ingredients, climate, and cultural traditions all influenced what appeared on the morning table. The empire was unified politically, but culinarily, it remained wonderfully diverse. Trade networks meant that wealthy Romans could occasionally enjoy exotic ingredients, spices from India, fish sauce from Spain, or honey from distant provinces. But these luxuries rarely appeared at breakfast, which remained stubbornly practical across all social classes. The rise of Christianity within the empire eventually began to influence meal practices, introducing concepts of fasting and dietary restrictions that hadn't existed in traditional Roman religion. But for most of the imperial period, breakfast remained a thoroughly secular affair, governed by availability and necessity rather than spiritual considerations. Women's roles in breakfast preparation were largely invisible in historical records, which focused on public life and male activities. But it was women who ground the grain, baked the bread, prepared the preserves, and managed the complex logistics of feeding families with limited resources. Their skill and knowledge kept the empire fed, even though history rarely bothered to record their names. Children learned eating habits early, developing tastes for the foods that would sustain them throughout their lives. A Roman child who grew up eating coarse bread and bitter olives would find those foods comforting as an adult. While exotic flavors might seem strange or even unpalatable, the implements used for eating breakfast were simple fingers, mostly, with the occasional knife for cutting cheese or bread. Forks wouldn't be invented for centuries, and spoons were reserved for liquid foods. Plates were often just pieces of bread that could be eaten after the meal, solving both the serving and cleanup problems simultaneously. Waste was minimal because everything edible was consumed. Bread crusts became soup thickeners, olive pits were pressed for their remaining oil, and even spoiled wine could be turned into vinegar. Nothing was thrown away that could possibly be repurposed, because survival depended on maximizing every resource. The sounds of breakfast preparation would have been part of the daily symphony of Roman cities. The grinding of grain in stone mills, the crackling of cooking fires, the clanking of water vessels, and the chatter of people beginning their day. It was a soundtrack of survival, played out in thousands of homes every morning. Markets opened early to serve the breakfast trade, with vendors selling fresh bread, cheese, olives, and wine to those who could afford to purchase rather than prepare their own food. These early markets were social hubs where news was exchanged along with coins, and where the pulse of the city could be felt in the urgency of morning transactions. Climate played a huge role in breakfast timing and content. In the hot summer months, Romans ate early to avoid cooking during the heat of the day. In winter, they might delay eating until the sun had warmed their homes enough to make food preparation bearable. The rhythm of meals followed the rhythm of the seasons in ways that our climate-controlled world has forgotten. The psychology of Roman breakfast was shaped by scarcity and uncertainty. Even wealthy Romans had grown up hearing stories of famines, crop failures, and food shortages. This created a mentality where food was never taken for granted, where every meal was appreciated simply for existing, and where waste was considered not just foolish, but almost immoral. As we settle deeper into this exploration of ancient morning rituals, it becomes clear that Roman breakfast was less about pleasure and more about preparation. It was the foundation upon which the empire's daily activities were built, providing just enough nutrition and energy to fuel the massive human machine that built roads, fought wars, administered provinces, and created the cultural legacy that still influences us today. The decline of Roman breakfast culture wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow transformation that reflected the broader changes happening throughout the empire. As political stability weakened and economic systems strained, the simple morning meal that had sustained millions began to change in ways that would have seemed unimaginable to earlier generations. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the empire was struggling with inflation, debasement of currency, and supply chain disruptions that made even basic foods increasingly expensive. The grain dole that had kept urban populations fed for centuries became irregular and unreliable. Bread, the foundation of Roman breakfast, began to disappear from the tables of all but the wealthiest citizens. The quality of available bread deteriorated as wheat shortages forced bakers to use inferior grains, sawdust, and other fillers that provided bulk but little nutrition. What had once been merely coarse and gritty became actively dangerous to eat. Stories circulated of people breaking teeth on stones in their bread or falling ill from consuming flour that had been adulterated with substances that weren't quite food. Wine, too, became problematic. Vineyards were abandoned as farmers fled to safer regions or were conscripted into the military. The wine that remained was often watered down beyond recognition or replaced entirely with beverages that bore only a passing resemblance to the posca that had sustained earlier generations. Even the wealthy found it difficult to obtain wine of decent quality. The social fabric that had supported Roman breakfast culture began to unravel. Extended families that had shared resources and knowledge for generations were scattered by wars, migrations, and economic pressures. The informal networks that had ensured knowledge of food preparation and preservation was passed down from mother to daughter began to break down. Urban populations, always dependent on food imported from rural areas, found themselves increasingly cut off from reliable sources of nutrition. The roads that had once efficiently transported grain from Egypt and other agricultural provinces became dangerous as bandits and barbarian raiders disrupted trade. Cities that had thrived on commerce began to empty as people fled to the countryside in search of food security. The insulae, where most Romans had lived, became death traps as maintenance ceased and buildings literally began to collapse. The cramped quarters that had once housed thriving communities became overcrowded slums where disease spread rapidly and food preparation became nearly impossible. The small braziers that had cooked countless breakfasts became fire hazards in buildings where no one could afford repairs. Slavery, which had provided the labor force for food preparation in wealthy households, became increasingly expensive and unreliable. As the empire's borders contracted and military campaigns became less successful, the steady supply of new slaves dried up. Existing slaves found opportunities to escape or demand better treatment, disrupting the household systems that had made elaborate food preparation possible. The knowledge base that had supported Roman cuisine began to erode. Recipes that had been passed down orally were lost when families were separated or killed. Written records of food preparation were luxury items that became increasingly rare as literacy declined and writing materials became expensive. The cultural memory of how to prepare even simple foods began to fade. Climate change during this period. Yes, climate change affected the ancient world too, brought unpredictable weather patterns that disrupted agricultural cycles. Harvests failed more frequently, and the crops that did survive were often of poor quality. The Mediterranean basin, which had enjoyed relatively stable weather for centuries, became subject to droughts, floods, and temperature fluctuations that made farming increasingly difficult. Military recruitment stripped rural areas of young men who might otherwise have worked the farms. Those who remained were often the very young, the very old, or the infirm, hardly the workforce needed for intensive agriculture. Fields that had produced grain for Roman breakfast tables for generations went to seed or were abandoned entirely. The bureaucratic systems that had managed food distribution throughout the empire became corrupted and inefficient. Officials who had once ensured that grain reached urban markets began to hoard supplies for themselves or sell them on black markets. The carefully maintained supply chains that had fed the empire broke down into a chaotic scramble for resources. Religious changes also affected breakfast culture. As Christianity gained influence, new ideas about fasting, dietary restrictions, and the spiritual significance of food began to change how people thought about their morning meal. Some embraced fasting as a form of devotion, while others found religious justification for hoarding food or excluding certain groups from shared meals. The barbarian invasions brought new populations with different food cultures and agricultural practices. Germanic tribes had their own breakfast traditions, which often conflicted with Roman customs. As these groups settled within the empire's borders, they brought changes to local food systems that further disrupted traditional Roman breakfast culture. Currency debasement made it difficult for ordinary people to purchase food. Coins that had once held their value became worthless almost overnight, and barter systems emerged to replace monetary exchange. A baker might accept a day's labor in exchange for bread, or a farmer might trade grain for metalwork. The simple transaction of buying breakfast became a complex negotiation. The legal systems that had protected food quality and trade began to break down. Regulations about bread weights, wine purity, and fair pricing became unenforceable as local authorities lost power or were replaced by new rulers with different priorities. Markets that had once operated under clear rules became chaotic free-for-alls where fraud and adulteration were common. Infrastructure decay affected every aspect of food preparation and distribution. Aqueducts that had provided clean water for cooking fell into disrepair. Roads that had carried grain from farms to cities developed potholes and became impassable. Bridges collapsed and weren't rebuilt, cutting off trade routes that had operated for centuries. The intellectual traditions that had supported Roman food culture also declined. The agricultural texts that had guided farming practices were lost or forgotten. The knowledge of food, preservation, nutrition, and cooking techniques that had been accumulated over centuries disappeared as the educational systems that transmitted this information broke down. Public health, always precarious in the ancient world, became catastrophic. Without clean water, proper sanitation, or adequate nutrition, diseases spread rapidly through populations that were already weakened by poor diet. Breakfast, instead of being a source of energy for the day, became a potential source of illness or death. The psychological impact of these changes was enormous. People who had grown up expecting a certain level of food security found themselves facing uncertainty with every meal. The simple act of waking up and eating something to start the day became fraught with anxiety about whether food would be available, whether it would be safe to eat, and whether there would be enough to sustain life. Social hierarchies that had once been relatively stable began to shift dramatically. Wealthy families found themselves eating foods that would have been considered peasant fare in earlier generations, while some former slaves or barbarians gained access to resources that allowed them better nutrition than established Roman citizens. Regional variations in breakfast culture, which had once been charming differences in local custom, became stark disparities in survival rates. Areas that maintained agricultural productivity could still support traditional breakfast patterns, while regions affected by war or climate change saw their food cultures collapse entirely. The transformation wasn't uniform across the empire. Some regions maintained elements of traditional Roman breakfast culture well into the medieval period, while others saw rapid and dramatic changes. The pace of decline varied depending on local conditions, leadership quality, and sheer geographical luck. As political authority fragmented, different regions developed different responses to food insecurity. Some communities organized collective farming efforts, while others descended into competitive hoarding. Some areas maintained trade relationships that provided access to diverse foods, while others became isolated and dependent on whatever could be produced locally. The emergence of new political structures, whether barbarian kingdoms, Christian institutions, or local strongmen, brought different approaches to food distribution and agricultural management. Some of these new authorities proved more effective than the failing Roman state at maintaining food security, while others were worse. Innovation in food production and preservation sometimes emerged from necessity. People developed new ways to make bread last longer, to extract nutrition from marginal crops, or to preserve foods without access to traditional ingredients. But more often, the knowledge base simply eroded, leaving communities less capable of feeding themselves than their ancestors had been. The memory of better times haunted those who lived through this transition. Elderly Romans could remember when bread was plentiful and wine was affordable, creating a sense of loss and nostalgia that colored their perception of the present. Stories of abundant breakfast tables became almost mythical, told to children who had never experienced food security. Trade networks that had once connected the breakfast tables of Britain to the grain fields of Egypt contracted to regional or even local systems. Foods that had been common became exotic luxuries, while local ingredients that had been scorned became precious resources. The cosmopolitan nature of Roman breakfast culture gave way to increasingly provincial and limited diets. The practical knowledge needed for food preparation began to be hoarded rather than shared. Families guarded recipes and preservation techniques as trade secrets, fearing that sharing knowledge might create competition for scarce resources. The open exchange of culinary information that had characterized earlier Roman culture was replaced by secrecy and suspicion. This erosion of Roman breakfast culture was part of a larger transformation that historians call the fall of the Western Roman Empire, though it might be more accurate to describe it as a slow-motion collapse that took place over generations. People didn't wake up one morning to find their empire gone. Instead, they gradually noticed that their daily bread was harder to obtain, lower in quality, and more expensive than it had been the year before. The grotesque details of late Roman breakfast culture would have been unimaginable to earlier generations who had taken food security for granted. By the 5th century, what passed for breakfast in many parts of the former empire bore little resemblance to the simple but adequate meals that had sustained the civilization at its height. Bread, when it could be obtained at all, often contained ingredients that would have horrified earlier Romans. Acorns, bark, sawdust, and various weeds were ground up and mixed with whatever grain was available. The resulting loaves were dense, bitter, and difficult to digest, but they provided bulk and some calories for people who had no other options. The texture of this bread was somewhere between wood and clay. It had to be soaked for hours before it could be chewed, and even then, it often caused digestive problems. Stories circulated of people breaking teeth on hidden stones, or metal fragments that had been accidentally ground into the flour. What had once been the staff of life became a daily reminder of how far civilization had fallen. The grinding process itself became a source of contamination as equipment deteriorated and proper maintenance became impossible. Mills that had once been carefully cleaned and maintained began to break down, leaving metal shavings and stone chips in the flour. The stones used for grinding developed cracks and rough surfaces that harbored bacteria and left dangerous debris in the final product. Quality control, which had never been perfect, became non-existent as regulatory systems collapsed. Bakers who had once faced legal consequences for adulterating their products now operated in a lawless environment where anything that could be sold as bread was acceptable. The guild systems that had maintained professional standards dissolved, leaving consumers with no protection from fraud or contamination. The grains themselves were often spoiled or contaminated before they even reached the mills. Farmers desperate to sell anything they could harvest would bring grain that was mouldy, insect-infested, or damaged by weather. Storage facilities that had once protected grain from pests and moisture fell into disrepair, allowing rat droppings, fungus, and decay to contaminate what might otherwise have been edible. Different regions developed their own desperate bread substitutes as traditional grains became unavailable. In some areas, people learned to grind acorns into a bitter flour that could be mixed with whatever grain was available. Others experimented with tree bark, which provided bulk but little nutrition and often caused severe intestinal distress. The fermentation process that had once created the rise in bread became unpredictable as yeast cultures died out or became contaminated. Bakers tried to maintain sourdough starters, but without proper care and feeding, these often became sources of harmful bacteria rather than beneficial fermentation. The result was bread that was not only flat and dense, but potentially dangerous to consume. Salt, which had once been readily available for bread making, became a precious commodity as trade networks collapsed. Bread made without salt was not only flavourless, but also spoiled more quickly, creating yet another hazard for people who had no choice but to eat whatever was available. The ovens used for baking deteriorated along with everything else. Public bakeries that had once served entire neighbourhoods were abandoned as fuel became scarce and equipment broke down. Families tried to bake bread in small household ovens or over open fires, but without proper temperature control, the results were often inedible or dangerous. Even the water used in bread making became problematic as clean sources became contaminated or inaccessible. Bakers who had once used fresh spring water found themselves making bread with whatever liquid was available, often water that was visibly dirty or that smelled suspicious. The impact on both taste and safety was predictably catastrophic. The social ritual of bread breaking, which had been central to Roman meal culture for centuries, became a grim parody of its former self. Families that had once gathered to share fresh, wholesome bread found themselves mechanically distributing portions of something that barely qualified as food, eating in silence because there was nothing positive to say about the experience. Children who grew up during this period never learned what proper bread was supposed to taste like. For them, the bitter, gritty, contaminated loaves that constituted breakfast bread were normal. They had no frame of reference for understanding what their grandparents meant when they spoke nostalgically of soft, white bread that was actually pleasant to eat. The psychological impact of bad bread extended beyond mere disappointment. Bread had been so fundamental to Roman identity that its degradation felt like a degradation of civilization itself. People who had to choke down sawdust-filled loaves every morning were constantly reminded that their world had become a place where even the most basic necessities were no longer reliable. Desperate families developed elaborate rituals for making bad bread more palatable. They would soak it in whatever liquid was available, sometimes for days, until it broke down into a mushy gruel that could be consumed without chewing. Others would char it over fires, hoping that burning might mask the taste of decay or contamination. The hoarding of even terrible bread became common as people learned that tomorrow's supply might be even worse than today's. Families would hide portions of their awful breakfast bread, carefully wrapping it in cloth and storing it in secret places, knowing that spoiled bread was better than no bread at all. Some communities tried to maintain standards by pooling resources and knowledge, but these efforts often failed as social trust broke down. Cooperative bakeries that might have produced better bread required levels of coordination and mutual confidence that were increasingly rare in a world where survival had become an individual rather than community concern. The bread situation became so desperate in some areas that people began to view any grain-based food as a luxury, regardless of quality. Travelers reported communities where the appearance of even moldy, contaminated bread was greeted with celebration, as if the arrival of something that could technically be called bread was a minor miracle. Military units, which had once been supplied with adequate bread as part of their standard rations, found themselves eating the same degraded products as civilians. This created morale problems that contributed to the broader military difficulties facing the empire. Soldiers who couldn't count on decent food were less likely to maintain loyalty to commanders who couldn't provide basic necessities. The export of Roman bread-making techniques to barbarian territories ironically meant that some communities outside the empire began producing better bread than was available in Rome itself. This reversal of cultural prestige was particularly galling to Romans, who remembered when their civilization had been the standard by which all others were measured. Documentation of bread quality during this period is sparse, partly because people were too busy surviving to record their experiences, and partly because the reality was so grim that few wanted to preserve accounts of it for posterity. The occasional references that do survive suggest conditions that were worse than most historical accounts dare to describe. The transformation of bread from daily pleasure to daily ordeal became a metaphor for the broader transformation of Roman civilization. Just as bread had once represented the empire's ability to provide abundance and security for its citizens, the degradation of bread quality symbolized the collapse of all the systems that had made Roman life distinctive and desirable. Wine, too, underwent a grotesque transformation. As vineyards were abandoned or destroyed, people began to ferment whatever they could find. Fruits, vegetables, and even grains were turned into alcoholic beverages that bore no resemblance to the wine that had graced Roman tables for centuries. These drinks were often contaminated with harmful bacteria or adulterated with substances that caused illness or death. The posca, that had once been a simple mixture of water, wine, and vinegar, became a desperate concoction of whatever liquids were available. Stagnant water mixed with spoiled wine, flavoured with herbs that might mask the taste of decay, became the morning beverage for millions of people who had no alternative. The fact that it often caused dysentery or other illnesses was accepted as preferable to dying of thirst. Cheese production required skills, equipment, and resources that were increasingly rare. The simple, fresh cheeses that had been common breakfast fare were replaced by whatever could be scraped together from whatever milk was available. Often this meant cheese made from the milk of sick or dying animals, or cheese that had been contaminated during the production process. The storage and preservation of cheese became nearly impossible without proper facilities. Cheese that should have been consumed fresh was kept far too long, developing molds and bacteria that created flavors and textures that were, quite literally, nauseating. But hungry people ate it anyway, because the alternative was starvation. Olives, which had once been carefully cultivated and preserved, became whatever could be foraged from abandoned groves. These wild olives were often bitter to the point of being inedible, or they had been contaminated by insects, fungus, or animal waste. The careful brining and preservation techniques that had made olives palatable were lost as the knowledge and resources needed for proper food preparation disappeared. Even the simple act of obtaining water for cooking became a nightmare in many urban areas. Aqueducts that had once provided clean water fell into disrepair, leaving people dependent on wells that were often contaminated with sewage or animal waste. Rivers and streams became polluted as sanitation systems collapsed and industrial waste went untreated. The cooking facilities available to most people deteriorated as buildings crumbled and resources became scarce. The small braziers that had once provided heat for cooking became fire hazards in structures that could no longer be properly maintained. Cooking pots cracked and couldn't be replaced, forcing people to improvise with containers that were never designed for food preparation. Hygiene around food preparation, never particularly good by modern standards, became catastrophically bad. Without clean water, soap, or proper cleaning tools, cooking surfaces became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. Food poisoning, which had always been a risk, became a virtual certainty for anyone who ate regularly. The storage of food became a desperate exercise in damage control. Without proper containers, preservation methods, or cool storage spaces, food spoiled rapidly and often dangerously. People learned to eat around mold, to ignore bad smells, and to consume food that was clearly past its prime, because the alternative was having nothing to eat at all. Pest control became impossible as buildings decayed and resources disappeared. Rats, insects, and other vermin overran food storage areas, contaminating whatever supplies people managed to accumulate. Breakfast often meant eating food that had been partially consumed by rodents or that was crawling with insects. The quality of cooking oil deteriorated as olive groves were abandoned and other oil sources became scarce. Rancid oil, which would have been discarded in earlier times, was used for cooking because it was better than having no oil at all. The taste was revolting, but hunger made people overlook flavours that would have been unacceptable in better times. Meat, which had always been a luxury for most Romans, became not just expensive but dangerous when it could be obtained. Without proper preservation methods or refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly and often carried diseases that could kill. People who were desperate enough to eat questionable meat often paid with their lives. Even simple foods like eggs became hazardous as chickens and other birds were affected by the same environmental degradation that plagued human populations. Eggs from sick birds, or eggs that had been stored too long in improper conditions, caused illness that could be fatal for people who were already weakened by malnutrition. The social ritual of sharing breakfast disappeared as resources became so scarce that people hoarded whatever food they could find. Families that had once eaten together began to hide food from each other, leading to the breakdown of social bonds that had held communities together for generations. Markets, when they operated at all, became dangerous places where desperate people fought over scraps of food. The orderly commerce that had once characterized Roman trade was replaced by a chaotic struggle for survival. Vendors sold whatever they could find, regardless of quality or safety, and buyers had little choice but to accept whatever was available. The adulteration of food reached levels that were criminal by any standard. Bakers mixed sawdust into flour, wine merchants watered their products beyond recognition, and cheesemakers used milk from diseased animals. But regulation had collapsed, along with everything else, leaving consumers with no protection from fraud or contamination. Children grew up malnourished and stunted, never experiencing the adequate nutrition that had allowed earlier generations to thrive. Their physical and mental development was permanently affected by the poor quality and insufficient quantity of food available during their crucial growing years. The elderly, who had once been repositories of knowledge about food preparation and preservation, began to die off without passing their skills to younger generations. As they disappeared, so did the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Roman culinary culture, leaving communities less capable of feeding themselves than they had been in generations. Disease outbreaks became common as poor nutrition weakened immune systems and contaminated food spread illness through communities. What had once been minor health problems became fatal when combined with malnutrition and the stress of constantly worrying about where the next meal would come from. The psychological impact of this transformation was devastating. People who had grown up expecting certain basic standards of food quality and availability found themselves living in a world where survival required eating things that would have been considered inedible by their parents and grandparents. The breakdown of breakfast culture was both a symptom and a cause of broader social collapse. As people could no longer rely on adequate nutrition to start their day, their capacity for the physical and mental labor needed to maintain civilization declined. It became a vicious cycle where declining food quality led to declining social capacity, which led to further deterioration in food systems. Regional variations in the pace of decline created pockets of relative prosperity alongside areas of complete collapse. People in regions that maintained some agricultural productivity looked with horror at refugees from areas where breakfast had become a desperate scavenge for anything edible. The memory of better times became a form of psychological torture for those who had experienced the abundance of earlier generations. They could remember when bread was white and soft, when wine was pleasurable rather than merely safe to drink, and when breakfast was a simple pleasure rather than a daily struggle for survival. This grotesque transformation of Roman breakfast culture represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how quickly the foundations of civilization can erode. What had sustained millions of people for centuries disappeared within a few generations, leaving a legacy of knowledge lost and traditions broken that would take centuries to rebuild. The psychological transformation that accompanied the decline of Roman breakfast culture was perhaps more devastating than the physical deprivation itself. As the simple certainty of morning sustenance disappeared, it took with it something fundamental about how Romans understood themselves and their place in the world. For generations, Romans had awakened with the confidence that food would be available, that the systems their ancestors had built would continue to function, and that each day would begin with the basic dignity of a shared meal. This confidence wasn't conscious, it was as automatic as breathing, woven into the fabric of what it meant to be Roman. When that certainty vanished, it left behind a profound psychological void that affected every aspect of daily life. The mind adapts to scarcity in ways that would have been alien to earlier generations of Romans. People began to wake up, not with anticipation of the day ahead, but with anxiety about whether they would find enough food to survive even until evening. This constant stress fundamentally altered how people thought, planned, and related to each other. Hoarding became a psychological compulsion rather than a practical necessity. Even when food was available, people found themselves unable to consume it normally, instead hiding portions and obsessing over preservation. The abundance mentality that had characterized Roman culture at its height was replaced by a scarcity mindset that colored every decision and interaction. Trust, which had been the foundation of Roman commercial and social relationships, eroded as survival became the primary concern. People who had once shared freely with neighbors and family members began to view every other person as potential competition for scarce resources. The social bonds that had held communities together for centuries dissolved under the pressure of desperate hunger. Children who grew up during this period developed fundamentally different relationships with food than their parents and grandparents had known. For them, food was never abundant, never secure, never simply available. They learned to view eating as a competitive activity, to hide food from siblings, and to never trust that tomorrow's meal would materialize without a struggle. The elderly suffered particular psychological trauma as they watched the world they had known disappear. People who could remember when breakfast was a simple pleasure found themselves living in a reality where survival required consuming things they would never have considered food. The cognitive dissonance between memory and present reality created a form of ongoing grief that had no resolution. Depression became endemic as the simple pleasures that had made life bearable disappeared. The satisfaction of breaking fast with decent bread and wine had been one of life's reliable comforts. When that comfort vanished, it left people with fewer reasons to face each new day. Suicide rates, though poorly documented, appear to have increased dramatically during periods of extreme food scarcity. Anxiety disorders, though not understood in modern psychological terms, manifested in behaviors that would be recognizable to contemporary therapists. People developed obsessive rituals around food storage and preparation, checking and rechecking supplies that might have spoiled or been stolen. Sleep became difficult as the mind churned with worries about tomorrow's sustenance. The breakdown of traditional family structures was both a cause and effect of changing breakfast culture. When food became scarce, families that had once gathered for morning meals began to fragment as members searched for individual survival strategies. Parents who could not provide adequate nutrition for their children faced psychological burdens that were difficult to bear. Religious beliefs, which had once provided comfort and meaning, began to shift in response to the daily struggle for survival. Some people turned to extreme forms of devotion, viewing their suffering as divine punishment or spiritual purification. Others abandoned faith entirely, unable to reconcile their beliefs with the reality of watching loved ones slowly starve. The cognitive effects of malnutrition compounded the psychological trauma of social collapse. Brains that were deprived of adequate nutrition could not function normally, leading to poor decision-making, memory problems, and an inability to plan effectively. This created a feedback loop where malnutrition led to behaviors that worsened food insecurity. Social status, which had once been clearly defined by access to better food, became a source of ongoing psychological torment. Former aristocrats found themselves eating the same spoiled bread as former slaves, while some barbarian leaders gained access to resources that allowed them better nutrition than established Roman families. The predictable social order that had provided psychological stability for centuries crumbled along with the food systems. The collapse of traditional hierarchies created a form of cognitive dissonance that was particularly difficult for older Romans to process. People who had spent their entire lives understanding their place in society through food-related privileges found themselves in a world where these markers no longer functioned. Former senators might find themselves begging for scraps from Germanic chieftains, while ex-slaves who had adapted quickly to new power structures enjoyed better meals than their former masters. This social upheaval was made more traumatic by the fact that food had been such a visible marker of status in Roman society. Everyone had known exactly where they stood in the social hierarchy based on what they ate for breakfast. When these distinctions disappeared, people lost not just their social position, but their fundamental understanding of how society was supposed to work. The psychological adaptation required to survive in this new environment was enormous. People had to completely restructure their understanding of value, worth, and social relationships. Skills that had been important in traditional Roman society: rhetorical ability, knowledge of law, familiarity with literature became irrelevant compared to practical abilities like food procurement, preservation, and preparation. Children who came of age during this transition faced particular psychological challenges. They were caught between two worlds: the stories their parents told of better times and the harsh reality of their daily experience. Many developed a cynical worldview that rejected the values and aspirations that had motivated previous generations, while others retreated into fantasy and denial. The breakdown of traditional education systems meant that young people grew up without the cultural framework that had helped previous generations make sense of their world. Roman education had emphasized the connection between individual virtue and social responsibility, but this philosophy became meaningless in a world where survival required behaviors that violated traditional moral codes. Family dynamics were fundamentally altered as economic necessity forced changes in traditional roles. Children who had been expected to respect and obey their parents found themselves as the primary food providers for their families, creating power reversals that challenged basic assumptions about authority and responsibility. Marriage and family formation became increasingly difficult as young adults focused on individual survival rather than building stable relationships. The economic foundations that had supported traditional Roman family structures disappeared, leaving people to navigate intimate relationships without the social and material supports that had made families stable for generations. Religious and philosophical beliefs that had provided comfort and meaning became sources of additional psychological distress. Traditional Roman religion had emphasized the god's favor toward the empire and its people, but the evidence of daily life suggested either that the gods had abandoned Rome or that they had never existed at all. The rise of Christianity offered some comfort to those who could find meaning in suffering, but it also created new forms of psychological conflict. Christian teachings about accepting hardship and trusting in divine providence sometimes conflicted with the practical steps needed for survival, leaving believers torn between spiritual and physical needs. Memory became a form of psychological torture for people who could clearly remember better times. The ability to recall when food was abundant, when social structures were stable, and when the future seemed predictable made present suffering more acute. Some people deliberately tried to suppress these memories, while others became obsessed with them to the point of mental breakdown. The constant stress of food insecurity created physical changes in the brain that affected cognitive function and emotional regulation. People who had once been capable of complex reasoning and long-term planning found themselves unable to think beyond the immediate question of where their next meal would come from. Sleep disorders became endemic as hungry minds found it impossible to rest. People reported dreams of abundance that made waking to reality more painful, or nightmares about starvation that prevented restorative sleep. The exhaustion that resulted from poor sleep made it even more difficult to cope with the daily challenges of finding food and maintaining minimal living standards. Social relationships became increasingly transactional as people learned to value others primarily for their ability to provide access to food or other survival necessities. Friendships, marriages, and family bonds that had once been based on affection and shared values became cold calculations about mutual benefit and resource sharing. The loss of future orientation was perhaps the most devastating psychological change. Roman culture had always emphasized the importance of building for posterity, of creating lasting achievements that would benefit future generations. When survival became uncertain from day to day, This long-term thinking became impossible, leaving people without the sense of purpose that had motivated their ancestors. Guilt and shame became constant companions for people who were forced to make choices that violated their deeply held moral beliefs. Parents who couldn't provide adequate food for their children, people who stole to survive, and individuals who abandoned friends or family members who had become burdens, all carried psychological wounds that never healed. The breakdown of community support systems meant that people who suffered psychological distress had nowhere to turn for help. Traditional forms of social support extended families, religious institutions, community organizations either disappeared entirely or became focused solely on material survival rather than emotional well-being. Violence, both witnessed and perpetrated, left psychological scars that affected entire generations. People who had grown up in relatively peaceful communities found themselves living in a world where brutality was commonplace, where neighbors turned against each other over food, and where basic human decency became a luxury that few could afford. The constant uncertainty created a form of learned helplessness that made it difficult for people to take advantage of opportunities for improvement when they did arise. Communities that might have been able to organize effective responses to their challenges often failed to do so because the residents had become psychologically conditioned to expect failure and disappointment. Survivors' guilt affected those who managed to maintain better conditions than their neighbors. People who had access to adequate food often found themselves unable to enjoy it, knowing that others were suffering. This created a psychological burden that made even successful adaptation to the new conditions emotionally devastating. The transformation of cultural values was perhaps the most profound psychological change of all. People who had been raised to value honor, duty, and civic responsibility found themselves living in a world where these concepts were not just irrelevant, but potentially dangerous. The cognitive dissonance between inherited values and survival necessities created internal conflicts that were impossible to resolve satisfactorily. Violence around food became commonplace, and witnessing or participating in this violence left psychological scars that lasted generations. People who had once been peaceful farmers or shopkeepers found themselves fighting over scraps of bread, stealing from neighbors, or watching their children slowly waste away from hunger. These experiences fundamentally changed how they viewed themselves and humanity in general. The loss of cultural identity was perhaps the most profound psychological trauma. Roman breakfast had been more than sustenance. It had been a daily affirmation of belonging to a civilization that valued order, abundance, and shared prosperity. When that daily ritual disappeared, it took with it a fundamental sense of who Romans were as a people. Survivors' guilt affected those who managed to maintain better nutrition than their neighbors. People who had access to adequate food often found themselves unable to enjoy it, knowing that others were suffering. This created a psychological burden that made even successful adaptation to the new conditions emotionally devastating. The breakdown of intergenerational knowledge transfer created a unique form of psychological distress. Parents who could not teach their children the skills needed for food preparation and preservation felt like failures, while children who grew up without this knowledge faced an uncertain future. The sense of cultural continuity that has sustained families for generations was severed. Memory itself became a form of torture for those who had experienced better times. The ability to remember when food was abundant and breakfast was pleasurable made present suffering more acute. Some people deliberately tried to forget their past comfort, while others clung to memories as their only source of psychological sustenance. Shame became a constant companion for people forced to eat things they would never have considered food in better times. The human dignity that had been preserved even in poverty during the empire's height disappeared when survival required behaviors that violated deeply held cultural norms about appropriate food and eating practices. The uncertainty of not knowing when or if the next meal would come created a state of chronic stress that affected every aspect of mental function. People could not focus on long-term planning, creative endeavors, or social relationships when their minds were constantly occupied with the immediate question of survival. Social rituals that had provided psychological comfort and community bonding disappeared along with the food that had made them possible. Festivals, religious observances, and family gatherings that had centered around shared meals became impossible to maintain, leaving people without the social structures that had provided meaning and connection. The transformation of morning routines had cascading psychological effects throughout the day. When people could no longer count on beginning each day with adequate nutrition, their capacity for the physical and mental labor needed to maintain even basic living standards declined. This created a sense of helplessness that pervaded all aspects of life. Children's psychological development was permanently altered by growing up during this period of food insecurity. They learned to view the world as fundamentally unreliable and threatening, developing survival instincts that would affect their relationships and decision-making for the rest of their lives. Trust, optimism, and the ability to plan for the future were casualties of childhood malnutrition. The constant focus on food acquisition and preservation crowded out other mental activities that had once provided pleasure and meaning. People who had once enjoyed literature, art, philosophy, or simple conversation found their mental energy entirely consumed by the practical demands of finding enough calories to survive. Dreams and sleep patterns were affected as hungry minds obsessed over food even during rest. People reported dreams of abundance that made waking to reality more painful, or nightmares about starvation that prevented restorative sleep. The psychological respite that sleep had once provided was compromised by the body's desperate need for nutrition. The breakdown of Roman breakfast culture wasn't just about food, it was about the destruction of a way of life that has sustained millions of people for centuries, leaving psychological wounds that would be passed down through generations long after the Western Roman Empire had formally ceased to exist. When the end finally came for traditional Roman breakfast culture, it arrived not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet resignation of people who had slowly learned to expect less from each new day. There was no single moment when someone declared that the old ways were finished. Instead, there was simply a gradual recognition that the world their ancestors had known was gone forever. The last generation to remember abundant Roman breakfasts found themselves in the strange position of being living museums of a vanished way of life. Their stories of white bread, good wine, and fresh cheese began to sound like fairy tales to younger people who had never experienced such luxuries. These elderly Romans became repositories of knowledge that was no longer relevant to a world that could barely provide basic sustenance. Some communities made conscious decisions to abandon traditional Roman breakfast practices in favor of whatever adaptations might improve their chances of survival. Villages that had maintained Roman customs for centuries suddenly shifted to Germanic, Celtic, or other cultural practices that seemed better suited to the new reality. It was a pragmatic choice, but it marked the formal death of traditions that had endured for generations. Others clung desperately to the remnants of Roman breakfast culture, even when it no longer made practical sense. Families that had no wheat would still attempt to make bread from acorns or bark, trying to maintain the ritual even when the substance had completely changed. These efforts were both touching and tragic attempts to preserve dignity and identity in circumstances that had stripped away almost everything else. The physical infrastructure that had supported Roman breakfast culture simply crumbled away. Bakeries closed when there was no grain to bake. Markets emptied when there were no goods to sell. Wells were abandoned when there were no people left to maintain them. The material foundation of civilization eroded as surely as the social structures it had supported. Written records of the transformation are sparse, partly because literacy declined along with everything else, and partly because people were too focused on survival to document their experiences. What records do exist are often brief, matter-of-fact accounts that hint at suffering without fully describing it. No bread today, becomes a common notation in personal documents, understated in a way that makes the crisis seem almost routine. Religious institutions, which had begun to play larger roles in food distribution, eventually took over many of the functions that Roman civil society had once performed. Monasteries and churches became centres for food production and distribution, but their approaches were fundamentally different from the secular systems they replaced. The shift marked not just a change in who provided food, but in how society understood the relationship between individual need and community responsibility. New political authorities that emerged from the collapse often explicitly rejected Roman customs in favour of their own traditions. Barbarian kings who established successor kingdoms had no interest in maintaining Roman breakfast culture, viewing it as part of a decadent system that had deserved to fall. Their own food traditions became the new normal, completing the transition away from Roman practices. The death of Roman breakfast culture was confirmed when the last people who could remember it began to die off. With them died not just personal memories, but practical knowledge about food preparation, preservation, and distribution that had accumulated over centuries. Their children and grandchildren inherited a world where this knowledge was irrelevant, and so it simply disappeared. Archaeological evidence from this period tells the story of decline that written sources often omit. Excavations of late Roman sites reveal smaller cooking areas, fewer food storage facilities, and dining implements that suggest people were eating different types of food in different ways. The material culture of breakfast literally changed as the civilization that had created it faded away. Trade networks that had once connected breakfast tables across the empire simply ceased to function. The grain ships that had carried Egyptian wheat to Rome stopped sailing. The wine that had come from Gaul was no longer available. The olive oil that had travelled from Spain became a luxury that few could afford. Local communities were forced to become self-sufficient in ways they hadn't been for centuries. The linguistic evidence of this transformation is subtle but telling. Latin words for specific types of bread, wine preparations, and breakfast rituals began to disappear from common usage. New languages that emerged from the mixing of Latin with Germanic, Celtic, and other tongues often lacked vocabulary for foods and practices that were no longer part of daily life. Climate change, which had contributed to the agricultural failures that undermined food security, continued to make traditional Roman farming practices impossible in many regions. Even communities that might have wanted to maintain old customs found that the environmental conditions that had supported them no longer existed. Population decline meant that there were simply fewer people available to maintain the complex systems that had supported Roman breakfast culture. Villages that had once supported bakeries, markets, and specialized food producers were reduced to a handful of families who had to focus on basic survival rather than cultural preservation. The psychological acceptance of this death was perhaps the most profound aspect of the transformation. People who had spent years struggling to maintain some vestige of traditional practices eventually reached a point where they simply let go. It became easier to adapt to new ways of eating and living than to continue fighting for customs that no longer served any practical purpose. Some historians argue that Roman breakfast culture didn't really die, but evolved into the food traditions of medieval Europe. There's truth to this perspective. Many techniques, ingredients, and practices did survive in modified forms. But the integrated system that had characterized Roman civilization was gone, replaced by fragmented local traditions that bore little resemblance to their origins. The final irony of this death was that it often occurred in places where Roman political and military power had never been stronger. Some of the last bastions of traditional Roman breakfast culture were found in frontier regions where military necessity had preserved certain aspects of imperial organization long after they had disappeared from the heartland. Records from the Byzantine Empire, which considered itself the continuation of Rome, suggest that even there, breakfast culture had transformed beyond recognition. The foods, preparation methods, and social customs that surrounded the morning meal in Constantinople bore little resemblance to what had existed in Rome at the height of imperial power. The death wasn't uniform or simultaneous. Some regions maintained elements of Roman breakfast culture well into the medieval period, while others had abandoned it centuries earlier. The transformation occurred at different rates depending on local conditions, creating a patchwork of cultural survival and change across the former empire. By the time historians began to take interest in documenting these changes, most of the people who could have provided first-hand accounts were long dead. The death of Roman breakfast culture had occurred in the shadows, unremarked and unrecorded, leaving only fragmentary evidence of what had once been a daily reality for millions of people. The final judgment on Roman breakfast culture might be that it died as it had lived pragmatically, without ceremony, and in service to the basic human need for survival. When the systems that had supported it could no longer function, people quietly moved on to whatever alternatives were available, leaving behind only scattered traces of a way of life that had once seemed permanent and universal, and so ended one of history's longest-running breakfast traditions, not with mourning or celebration, but with the simple recognition that the world had changed in ways that made the old ways impossible. The Romans had built an empire that lasted 1,000 years, but they couldn't build a breakfast culture that could survive the empire's collapse. As we reach the end of this exploration into the daily rhythms of ancient Roman life, it's worth reflecting on what this seemingly mundane topic reveals about the fragility of the systems we take for granted. Roman breakfast wasn't just about food. It was about the entire infrastructure of civilization that made simple pleasures possible. The story of what Romans ate when they woke up is really the story of how complex societies function, how they maintain themselves, and how they ultimately transform or collapse. Every slice of bread represented supply chains that stretched across continents. Every cup of wine embodied trade relationships that connected diverse cultures, and every shared meal reflected social structures that had evolved over centuries. Modern breakfast culture, with its global supply chains and complex food processing systems, might seem more sophisticated than its Roman predecessor, but it's built on foundations that are remarkably similar. We depend on the same basic requirements that sustained Roman breakfast tables: reliable agriculture, efficient transportation, stable political systems, and shared social customs that make communal eating possible. The decline and fall of Roman breakfast culture offers a sobering reminder of how quickly the systems that support our daily lives can change. The Romans who lived through the transformation of their food culture probably didn't recognize that they were witnessing the end of an era. To them, it likely seemed like a series of temporary difficulties that would eventually be resolved. There's something both humbling and oddly comforting about the ordinariness of Roman breakfast. These weren't gods or mythical heroes struggling with cosmic forces. They were people trying to find something decent to eat before starting their day. Their concerns were fundamentally human: getting enough nutrition, feeding their families, and maintaining some small measure of dignity in the face of circumstances beyond their control. The knowledge that even the mighty Roman Empire couldn't maintain something as basic as adequate breakfast for its citizens puts our own challenges in perspective. Food insecurity, supply chain disruptions, and economic inequality aren't new problems invented by the modern world. They're ancient human struggles that have been playing out for millennia in kitchens and markets across the globe. Yet there's also something inspiring about the resilience that allowed people to adapt when their old ways of eating became impossible. Communities found new solutions, developed different traditions, and created cultural innovations that allowed them to survive, even when the systems their ancestors had built failed them completely. The archaeological remains of Roman breakfast culture, the grinding stones, the cooking pots, the storage jars remind us that every civilization leaves behind traces of its daily routines. Future archaeologists studying our own breakfast culture will find evidence of global trade networks, industrial food processing, and social customs that we consider completely normal. but which might seem as strange to them as Roman posca seems to us. Perhaps the most important lesson from Roman breakfast culture is that the ordinary moments of daily life deserve attention and respect. History tends to focus on wars, politics, and great events, but the reality of human experience is mostly about smaller things: finding food, sharing meals, and carrying on the routines that make life bearable and meaningful. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe with a glass of water by your bedside and the comfortable knowledge that breakfast will be available in the morning, remember that this simple security represents one of the great achievements of human civilization. The ability to wake up confident that food will be available is a luxury that most people throughout history have never known. The Romans built roads and aqueducts that still inspire awe, but they also built something less visible and perhaps more important, a culture that valued the simple dignity of beginning each day with adequate nutrition. When that culture disappeared, it took with it not just a way of eating, but a way of understanding what it means to live together in organized society. Sweet dreams, and may your own breakfast tomorrow be everything the last Romans could only remember and dream about: abundant, safe, and shared with people you care about. In that simple morning meal, you'll be participating in one of humanity's oldest and most essential rituals. One that connects you across the centuries to every person who has ever faced a new day with hope and hunger.